Imagine settling into somewhere comfortable right now. A bed, a couch, maybe a chair pulled close to a lamp whose light is already starting to feel unnecessary. The room around you is quiet, or close to it, and whatever the day asked of you is finally starting to release its grip. Wherever you are in the world, whatever hour the clock says, you've chosen this moment to let your mind travel somewhere else entirely. Tonight it travels to the edge of an empire. Somewhere around the early 2nd century, a Roman legion disappeared. Not in the way that armies sometimes dissolve slowly over years of attrition and neglect, but simply vanished from the historical record, its fate unrecorded, its ending unwitnessed by any document we have yet found. For a civilization as meticulous as Rome, one that tracked its military units across centuries with remarkable consistency, a silence like that is strange. It is the kind of silence that pulls at historians the way a missing page pulls at a reader. The legion in question was the IXth Hispana, an ancient and decorated unit that had marched across Spain, crossed into Britain, fought through forests and marshes and open rebellion, and then, somewhere near Rome's cold northern frontier, simply ceased to appear in the records we have inherited. What happened to them is one of history's quieter mysteries, not dramatic in the way of a great battle or a sudden catastrophe, but slow and puzzling, the way a fog moves in, until you look up and realize you can no longer see what was there before. The story ahead mixes genuine historical evidence with long stretches of scholarly silence and more than a little legend that grew up to fill the space where facts ran out. We'll try to hold those things carefully separate and notice where the boundary blurs. But before we go any further, we'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Drop it in the comments, your city, your country, what time it is there. There's something quietly wonderful about knowing this story is reaching people across so many different darknesses at once. To understand why the disappearance of the Ninth matters, it helps to understand what a Roman legion actually was, not just as a military unit, but as a living institution, a moving city of trained men that carried the weight of Rome wherever it went. In the imperial period, roughly the era we're concerned with here, a full-strength legion consisted of around 5,000 to 6,000 soldiers, heavy infantry, trained to a standard that few armies in the ancient world could match. These men didn't simply fight together. They built together. They dug together. They ate together according to a fixed routine, slept in camps laid out to the same geometric plan, whether they were in the Syrian desert or the hills of northern Britain, and carried with them the tools to construct a fortified encampment at the end of every march. A legion on the move was, in a very real sense, a portable civilization, self-sufficient, disciplined, and deeply embedded in the administrative machinery of the empire that it served. Each legion was divided into 10 cohorts, and each cohort into 6 centuries, a century being not 100 men as the name might suggest, but around 80. At the head of it all was a legate, a senator appointed by the emperor, flanked by tribunes and a staff of experienced officers called centurions, the actual backbone of any legion's daily function. These were career soldiers, men who had climbed through the ranks over decades, and losing them along with an entire unit was not simply a headcount problem. It was an institutional loss, the kind that took years to rebuild. Legions were also symbols. Rome invested enormous meaning in its military units. Each legion carried an eagle standard, the aquila, which was treated almost as a living embodiment of the legion's honor. To lose the eagle in battle was a catastrophe that could haunt an emperor for the rest of his reign. Augustus, who lost 3 legions and their eagles in the forests of Germany in 9 AD, reportedly spent the rest of his life muttering the name of the general he blamed. Rome actually recovered 2 of those eagles over the following decades. The third was never found. So a legion wasn't simply an army, it was a name, a history, a bureaucratic entity with records attached to it, rosters of soldiers, pay accounts, construction logs, supply requisitions, correspondence with governors and emperors. The Roman administrative system was remarkably thorough by ancient standards, and legions left paper trails. Not paper exactly, wax tablets, papyrus, stone inscriptions, but trails nonetheless, fragmentary by now, but present, which is precisely why their absence tells us something. The Ninth Hispana fits into this picture in a way that makes it particularly traceable and therefore particularly puzzling to lose. Its name likely derived from an early posting in Spain, Hispania, where it may have served during the later years of the Roman Republic or the reign of Augustus. By the time we pick up its clearest thread, it was already an old unit with a long history, the kind of legion that had accumulated battle honours the way a ship accumulates barnacles, layer by layer, over generations of service. Legions like this were not recruited from a single place for their entire existence. Early on, a legion might draw heavily from one region, which often shaped its nickname. But as decades passed and veterans retired, replacements came from wherever the empire could supply them. Provincials who had earned citizenship, volunteers from across a world that stretched from Scotland to Mesopotamia. The Ninth, by the time it reached Britain, was almost certainly a cosmopolitan force in ways its original name no longer quite described. What makes the Ninth historically traceable is the survival of inscriptions. Roman soldiers, and the officers above them, left stone records of their service, dedications to gods, building commemorations, funerary markers. These aren't complete records by any means, but they form a kind of skeletal timeline, and for the Ninth, that skeleton is legible up to a point. We can follow the unit through Spain, through its service in the Balkans, into Britain under the Emperor Claudius in 43 AD, through campaigns and crises and partial reconstructions, right up until the evidence simply thins and stops. That thinning of evidence is what separates a genuine mystery from an ordinary administrative gap. Legions were regularly renamed, reorganized, split into detachments, or absorbed into other units. Rome's military was a dynamic system, not a static one. A legion might send a large detachment, called a vexillation, to serve elsewhere for years at a time, effectively operating as an independent force while the parent unit continued to exist on paper. If you only had partial records, you might mistake a temporarily separated detachment for an entirely absent legion. Historians are careful about this distinction. The question isn't simply whether the Ninth stopped being mentioned after a certain date. The question is whether there's any evidence it continued to exist in a new form, under a new name, in a new place, reconstituted after some catastrophic loss. For many legions, that evidence exists. Units were destroyed and rebuilt, sometimes multiple times, across Roman history, and the records usually show the seam. With the Ninth, the seam is missing. There's no record of disbandment, no record of reconstitution, no later inscription bearing its number and its name. It doesn't transform. It doesn't reappear. It just stops. That specific kind of silence is what historians mean when they talk about the mystery of the Ninth Hispana. Not simply that its records are incomplete. Incomplete records are normal, expected, the condition of all ancient history, but that the incompleteness has a particular shape, a thread that was there and then wasn't, with no knot tied at the end. What came before that silence is a long and genuinely fascinating story, and it begins, as so many Roman stories do, far from the place where things finally went wrong. When we last left the Ninth, it was somewhere in the western provinces, one legion among many in the rolling machinery of Roman expansion. To bring it to the damp hills and windswept frontiers where it would earn its reputation, we have to go back to a time when Rome was still knitting together the edges of a world it had conquered in pieces. The Hispana in its name is our first clear waypoint. At some stage in the late Republic or under Augustus, the Ninth served in Hispania, helping to finish a long, grinding process that had begun generations earlier. Spain was not taken in a single dramatic campaign. It was absorbed slowly through siege and starvation and road building, through treaties made and broken, through small wars that dragged on for years in mountain valleys and forested uplands. Legions like the Ninth were the sharp end of that process. They pacified territories that had been formally conquered on parchment but still resisted in practice. They watched over new roads that allowed tax collectors and merchants to move more easily, and they stamped down uprisings that flared whenever a local chieftain decided he had had enough of Roman tribute demands. In places like northern Spain, where tribes such as the Cantabri and Astures held out in difficult terrain. The presence of a reliable, battle-tested legion mattered. Rome could not simply proclaim an empire, it had to enforce one, and enforcement meant seasoned units, familiar with hard marching, winter campaigns, and the stubbornness of people who knew every ridge and ravine of their homeland and saw no reason to trade it for Roman law and Latin inscriptions. The ninth, in this phase of its life, was likely doing the kind of work that didn't always make it into grand historical narratives. Securing passes, garrisoning small forts, escorting governors, joining combined forces when a larger campaign required multiple legions to move together, like the cogs of a single vast engine. The men in its ranks would have been a mix of Italian veterans and provincials recruited locally or from neighbouring regions, all bound by discipline, pay, and the long promise of eventual discharge and a plot of land. As Rome's grip tightened in the west, legions gradually became available for use elsewhere. Augustus and his successors were always juggling these units, shifting them like heavy pieces on a very large board. A quiet frontier could afford to lose a legion, a troubled one needed reinforcement. Before long, attention turned to an island that had loomed on Rome's horizon for centuries: Britain. Britain was not unknown to Rome. Julius Caesar had crossed the Channel in the 1st century BC, fought some battles, and taken hostages, but these had been demonstrations of power rather than permanent conquest. The island remained outside the formal boundaries of empire, its tribes alternately trading with Roman merchants and raiding Roman shores. Under the Emperor Claudius, that changed. In 43 AD, a full-scale invasion was launched. Several legions participated, including the Ninth. For a unit whose identity was tied to past service in Spain, this was a major redeployment, from the sun and dust of the Iberian interior to an island known for rain, fog, and people the Romans tended to describe as both warlike and unpredictable. The early conquest of Britain was not smooth, nor was it quick. The southern and eastern parts of the island fell first, as legions moved inland from landing sites on the coast, supported by auxiliary troops recruited from across the empire. The Ninth was part of this initial wave, advancing against tribal confederations that alternately tried to resist, negotiate, or maneuver between rival Roman and local powers. In this phase, the legion's life would have involved long marches through wet countryside, the establishment of marching camps each evening, and the steady extension of Roman supply lines. Rivers were bridged, roads were driven through forests. Forts were built where the army intended to stay, or needed to secure a critical junction. Each of these acts left archaeological traces, and some of those traces bear the marks of the Ninth's presence: dedications, tile stamps, inscriptions noting that this cohort or that century of the Ninth built, repaired, or occupied a particular structure. Britain under Roman rule, especially in the 1st century, was a place of tension. On the one hand, towns began to appear with Roman-style forums and bathhouses. Villas were built by local elites who decided to align themselves with Roman power. Trade flowed through new ports, bringing wine, oil, and ceramics from far away. On the other hand, the conquest was incomplete, the loyalty of local rulers uncertain, and the line between pacified and restive territory could be thin. The Ninth found itself stationed in this landscape, increasingly associated with the northern zone of operations. The further north a legion went, the more the Roman presence thinned out. South of them, in what would become more thoroughly Romanized areas, life could begin to look almost Mediterranean in miniature. To the north, across rolling hills and boggy ground, lay tribes who had not accepted Roman rule, or who accepted it only so long as it seemed convenient. Campaigns in these areas were often small-scale, but constant. Columns of legionaries and auxiliaries moved out to punish raiders, to enforce tribute, or to support friendly client kings against their rivals. Frontier warfare, for Rome, was usually not a single great climactic battle, but an ongoing rhythm of marches, skirmishes, fort-building, and occasional hard fights when a larger tribal confederation decided to test the empire's resolve. Somewhere in this process of extending Roman control, the ninth seems to have taken real punishment. One of the most dramatic shocks came during the revolt led by Boudica in 60 or 61 AD. Boudica was queen of the Iceni, a tribe in eastern Britain whose treatment at Roman hands, including flogging her and abusing her daughters, according to Tacitus, helped ignite a powerful rebellion. When the uprising spread, it did so with terrifying speed. Roman towns were burned. The colony at Colchester, with its temple to the deified Claudius, was destroyed. London, still a young trading town, was evacuated and put to the torch. St. Albans was also attacked. Tens of thousands of people may have died in a matter of weeks. The IX Hispana, under its legate at the time, attempted to relieve the colony at Colchester. Instead, it seems to have been ambushed. Ancient sources suggest that its infantry was largely cut to pieces, only parts of its cavalry managed to escape. This was not the complete annihilation of the legion as an institution. It was later rebuilt with new recruits. But it was a brutal reminder of how vulnerable even a Roman legion could be if caught in the wrong place at the wrong time by enemies who knew the ground and had numbers on their side. For the men who survived, and for those who joined the reconstituted Ninth afterward, Britain would not have felt like an ordinary posting. The rebellion was suppressed eventually, with heavy losses among the rebels and reprisals that left deep scars. Yet the damage to Rome's sense of security in Britain lingered. Governors became more cautious. The distribution of troops was reconsidered. The Ninth's reputation, bound up with that near disaster, became part of the island's military story. Over the following decades, the legion's path and Britain's frontier became more tightly intertwined. The Ninth appears in inscriptions at places like Lincoln and later in the north at York. It worked on roads, on fortifications, on the infrastructure that underpinned Roman control. It fought in smaller, less well-documented campaigns as governors pushed probes further into what is now northern England and southern Scotland. It stood watch over a line that was not yet a fixed wall, but a shifting, sometimes fragile boundary between Rome and the tribal polities beyond. By this time, the name Hispana was no longer a description of where its soldiers came from. It was part of the legion's identity, a badge of its long service. Yet for people living in Britain, and for later generations looking back, the Ninth was no longer thought of as a Spanish legion at all. It was a British one, or at least a Legion of Britain, the unit you would expect to find stamped on building stones in the north, mentioned in accounts of campaigns on the island, associated with stories of early, violent Roman rule. In this way, the Ninth Hispana became anchored in Britain's historical memory, partly through the cold evidence of inscriptions and literary references, and partly through the aura that clings to a unit that endures catastrophe and remains in a place for a long time. When, much later, its name vanishes from the record, that prior association gives the mystery its particular flavour. The question that begins to form is not only what happened to the Ninth, but what happened to the British Legion. Before we can approach that silence directly, we have to follow the last clear footsteps it left, through the forts it manned, the uprisings it faced, and the gradually darkening frontier where Rome's presence thinned, and the line between history and guesswork begins to blur. If you follow those last clear footsteps, they lead you north, to a place where Roman stone met British sky, the city the Romans called Eboracum, and we call York. By the late 1st century, the Ninth is securely tied to York, not in the airy way of later legends, but in the solid, literal sense of carved letters and stamped clay. Inscriptions tell us that the legion built, repaired, and occupied. Dedications name officers, emperors, and gods, and in between them, on the same slabs of stone, the legion's title appears, Legio IX Hispana. This is the kind of evidence historians cherish because it is both specific and quiet. A building inscription might say that under such and such emperor, with such and such governor in charge, the Ninth rebuilt a gate, or repaired a bathhouse, or worked on the fortress that crowned the riverside. In other places, roof tiles bear the stamped mark of the legion, impressed when the clay was still wet, before it was fired and laid into place. Those marks do not tell a story in the way a narrative historian like Tacitus does. They do something stranger. They reach across time as little acts of routine bureaucracy, proving that a particular unit was present on a particular spot of ground when the wet clay met the soldier's hand. From this sort of material, a pattern begins to emerge. The ninth, once a wandering instrument of conquest, becomes more of a fixture. By the year 71 AD, it seems to have been involved in campaigns in northern England under the governor Petilius Cerealis. York was founded, or refounded in this military context, a forward base in contested territory, a headquarters for a legion that would have to fight, build, and then fight again. As the years pass, the evidence mounts in layers. Altars, dedications, casual inscriptions scratched by bored soldiers, all telling us, in fragmentary chorus, that the ninth was here. It is not only York, either. The legion's name turns up associated with other northern sites, Lincoln, where it had previously been stationed, smaller forts and work projects scattered along the uncertain frontier line as Rome pushed its influence toward what is now Scotland. Each of these finds is a pin on the map, a tiny fixed point in time. Together, they let us say with confidence, in the later 1st century and into the early 2nd, the IX Hispana was the Legion of the North. It garrisoned York. It manned outposts. It repaired roads and forts. It did the slow, grinding labour of holding a difficult frontier. Then, gradually, the pins stop. The last secure pieces of evidence are deceptively modest. One inscription from York, often treated as the final clear shout of the ninth in Britain, appears to date from the early years of the Emperor Trajan, who ruled from 98 to 117 AD. It refers to building work carried out by the legion, mentioning its full title. There are debates about the exact date, as there so often are with stone, but the broad window seems to place the ninth in York in the first decade or two of the 2nd century. After that, the trail becomes faint, and then, very suddenly, it is gone. In an empire that prided itself on records, this absence grew striking the more historians looked at it. Other legions that remained in service into the 2nd century appear in lists, in inscriptions far from their home bases, in commemorative monuments scattered all over the Mediterranean world. They change stations, they gain or lose honorary titles. They reappear under different emperors, in different provinces, but they remain traceable. The ninth does not. What makes this silence especially loud is not just that one legion falls out of the story, but that the gap appears against a backdrop of increasing documentation. The 2nd century is, in some ways, a well-lit corridor in Roman military history. We have legionary lists from later writers. We have inscriptions naming units stationed along Hadrian's Wall. We have tile stamps and building records from forts all over Britain and the continent. In that glow, the absence of Legio IX Hispana feels like a shadow that should not be there. By the time later compilers list Rome's legions, the ninth no longer appears. Its number is missing from rosters where we might expect to find it, slotted neatly among its surviving sisters. This is the point where the trail truly goes cold. It is also where the modern imagination begins to warm up. The raw facts are simple enough. We can say with fair certainty that the ninth was active in Britain into the early 2nd century. We can say that it was stationed at York. We can say that, after a certain point, no further solid evidence of its existence survives, no clear inscriptions naming it, no certain references in the literary sources, no find that places it definitively anywhere in the empire. Beyond that, every step forward is a matter of degrees. What is confirmed, what is inferred, and what drifts out toward speculation. What is confirmed are those hard pieces of evidence, the stones and stamps and scattered mentions that fix the ninth in place and time. These are the foundation everyone agrees on. The legion was in Britain under Claudius. It suffered heavily during Boudicca's revolt. It was rebuilt. It later served in the north. It was active in York in the early 2nd century. After that, it is not clearly attested. What is inferred comes from reading patterns in the wider record. For example, some scholars note that by the reign of Hadrian, who ruled from 117 to 138, a different legion, Legio VI Victrix, appears in York. It takes over the fortress that had been associated with the Ninth. That suggests a replacement, one unit withdrawn or lost, another brought in to fill the gap. Similarly, when we look at lists of legions from later in the 2nd century, the absence of the Ninth suggests that by then it no longer existed as an active unit. A legion was an important administrative and logistical entity. If it had survived, we would expect to see its name among those of other long-lived legions still serving on various frontiers. These inferences feel strong, but they remain inferences. They tell us that something decisive happened between that last secure inscription in York and the later rosters where the Ninth is missing. They do not tell us what, or where, or exactly when. Speculation begins when we try to fill that gap with a story. Maybe, some argue, the legion was destroyed in Britain, in some northern war that went unrecorded or left only the vaguest traces in our surviving texts. Perhaps a major defeat prompted Hadrian's visit to Britain and the eventual building of his famous wall. Others suggest the legion was transferred east to fight on the Danube or against Rome's enemies in the Near East, and that its end came there, in some equally obscure disaster. A few proposals attempt to reconcile stray pieces of evidence, a possible mention on a tombstone, a damaged inscription that could be read more than one way, and build from them a new route for the legion's final march. These ideas may be persuasive, or not, depending on how one weighs the scraps they rest on, but none of them reaches the same level of certainty as that simple, stubborn inscription in York. None can be confirmed in the same way as a tile stamp pulled from British soil. The fragmentary nature of Roman evidence is what makes these competing interpretations possible. The empire generated a vast amount of writing, but only a small portion has survived, and that survival is uneven. Whole authors are lost. Provincial archives have vanished. Stones crack, inscriptions erode, coins corrode in the ground. What remains is not a seamless tapestry, but a patchwork with large, enticing holes. For most legions, enough patches survive to show a continuous pattern. For the Ninth, they do not. And because human minds dislike empty spaces, we are drawn to imagine what must have filled the gap. In this way, a simple documentary problem, the absence of later attestations, turns into a central historical puzzle. At some point in the early 2nd century, the IXth Hispana, an old and once prominent legion, ceased to exist as a functioning unit of the Roman army. We can be confident of that much. By the time later lists were compiled, the legion was gone. What we do not know is where this ending took place, or under what circumstances. Was it a single disastrous campaign, the kind that could wipe out thousands of men in a few days of fighting? Was it a slower process of disbandment, reorganization, or quiet destruction folded into the turmoil of imperial politics? Did its eagle standard fall in a boggy field in Britain, or on a distant riverbank under another grey sky entirely? Those are the questions that form the heart of the mystery. From here on, the story of the Ninth will be told not only in what is written, but in what is missing. To approach that mystery, we have to follow two main paths, one that keeps the legion in Britain, ending in a northern catastrophe, and another that sends it east into other wars and other silences. One path keeps the legion where we last see it, under the grey skies of northern Britain. Follow that line of thought, and the story narrows to a stark possibility that the Ninth did not slip quietly away, but died where it stood, somewhere beyond the settled lands, in a war we can no longer clearly see. This is the classic theory, and for a long time it was the dominant one. The Ninth, so the argument runs, disappeared from the record after years of service in Britain. A new legion took its headquarters at York. Later writers speak vaguely of serious troubles on the British frontier in the early 2nd century. Put these pieces together and a vivid picture emerges, the Ninth marching north from York into hostile country, into the territory of tribes the Romans had never fully subdued, and never coming back. To understand why this idea appealed, you have to imagine the geography not as a map in a book, but as a lived frontier. South of York, the landscape was increasingly Romanized: towns, villas, roads, and farms under imperial taxation and law. North of York, and especially north of the line of forts that would later be shadowed by Hadrian's Wall, the picture is different. Here, the empire thinned out. Roads grew rougher, settlements smaller, the distance between outposts of stone and timber longer. Beyond those outposts lay peoples who had not been drawn fully into the orbit of Rome, tribes whose leaders might accept Roman gifts one year and lead raids on Roman territory the next, whose internal rivalries and shifting alliances were little understood by the officials governing from. Comfortable houses far to the south. From the Roman perspective, this was a low, constant simmer of threat. A frontier like this swallowed up men and information. Patrols could vanish, messengers could be delayed. A small fort could be overwhelmed before news of its danger reached a larger base. In bad weather, an entire column could move for days through rain and mist, seeing nothing more than the next curve of the road and the next stand of trees. Into this environment, imagine a legion dispatched to restore order. Perhaps there had been raids across the frontier. Perhaps a client chief had been killed, or a Roman official humiliated. Perhaps a fort had fallen, or a cohort had been ambushed. The governor might have judged that a show of overwhelming force was needed, not just a few auxiliaries, but a full legion on the march, supported by allied troops, pushing into contested ground. It is here, in this imagined campaign, that writers have often placed the ninth's end. The theory runs like this: somewhere in the north, far from the centres of power, the legion met an enemy, or a combination of enemies it could not defeat. On broken ground, perhaps in woods or boggy hills, the column was attacked. Supply lines stretched, support faltered. The weather turned. A sudden rising of multiple tribes, or a large organized ambush, overwhelmed the Roman formation. The legion was destroyed, its eagle standard captured, its survivors scattered or hunted down. A catastrophe of this kind would fit very neatly with the later aura of legend that gathers around the ninth: a lost legion swallowed by the mists of the north, an eagle standard vanishing into barbarian hands. A disaster so complete that only the vaguest memory of it filtered back into the written record. It also sits comfortably with the way Rome sometimes responded to such defeats. A lost legion was an embarrassment. Its commander might die in battle or face punishment. Reports to the emperor could be framed cautiously. If the province was then stabilized, if the frontier was refortified and enemies punished in return campaigns, the official narrative could slide over the worst of what had happened. You can imagine a tidy inscription celebrating the restoration of peace, carved years later, standing where no detailed account of the earlier disaster survives. There is, as well, a suggestive coincidence in timing. The Emperor Hadrian visited Britain early in his reign, and under him the famous wall across northern England was built. Some modern scholars have seen in this building programme the echo of serious earlier trouble, perhaps a major defeat that persuaded Rome that a more permanent fortified frontier was necessary. In that story, the ninth's destruction becomes the dark prelude to the hard line of stone and turf stretching coast to coast. If you are inclined toward drama, the pieces almost arrange themselves. The ninth, an old and storied legion, strides north into danger, is cut down to the last standard bearer, and in the aftermath Hadrian draws a line and says, "No further." The idea is powerful. It has inspired novels and films. It satisfies a certain narrative hunger. But when we move from what would make a good story to what can be shown, the ground becomes less firm. The greatest weakness of the British disaster theory is also the simplest. There is no surviving ancient writer who plainly says that a legion was destroyed in Britain in this period. Later historians, who record other military catastrophes in detail, Teutoburg Forest in Germany, for example, or defeats in the East, do not give us a matching account for Britain. We have hints of trouble, but no clear direct reference to an entire legion being wiped out. There are, it is true, some literary fragments that can be read as possible signals. One early 2nd century writer mentions British tribes breaking through a frontier line. Another alludes to losses that required reinforcement. Modern historians have looked closely at these passages, and some see in them the shadow of something larger. Yet they remain just that, shadows. The texts do not name the ninth, and they do not describe an annihilation. When we look at the archaeology, the picture is similarly ambiguous. We can see forts rebuilt, suggesting earlier damage. We can trace the spread of coin hoards and signs of unrest. We know that the north of Britain continued to be a theatre of conflict into the 2nd century, but no battlefield has been found that can be confidently linked to the destruction of a whole legion. No mass grave, no unmistakable concentration of legionary equipment carrying the stamps of the ninth, no altar raised by survivors in memory of fallen comrades on a specific, named site. There is also the question of how Roman legions usually died. Complete annihilations did happen, but they were rare enough and shocking enough that they tended to be remembered. More often, units suffered heavy casualties, were pulled back, refilled with new recruits, merged with other units, or quietly reorganized. A legion could fade out of existence not in a single day, but over years its number retired after severe losses, its remaining men folded into sister legions. Set against that broader pattern, the idea of the ninth being entirely destroyed in a single unrecorded campaign feels more extreme. Not impossible, but demanding a correspondingly strong level of proof, which we do not currently have. And yet, the British catastrophe remains the most famous explanation for the legion's disappearance. Part of this is inertia. For much of the 20th century, before some alternative theories gained ground, this was the story repeated in popular histories. Part of it is narrative satisfaction, the image of the legion dying dramatically at the edge of the known world, far from Rome, fits easily into how we imagine frontiers and lost causes. It also has a certain internal economy. We know the legion was in Britain. We know it vanishes from the record not long before another legion takes its place in York. We know that the north of Britain posed serious military challenges. To say that the ninth died there, even if we cannot pinpoint the exact valley or hill, feels like closing the circle without having to imagine its eagle travelling thousands of miles to some other front. What we are left with, then, is a theory built from proximity and plausibility. The ninth was in Britain. Britain was dangerous. Sometime between its last clear appearance and the later lists, the legion ceased to exist. A major defeat on the British frontier could explain this and would harmonise with the later myths that grew up around the legion's fate. But the missing piece, the contemporary unequivocal testimony that would fix the event in time and place, has not survived. Lying in the dark, you can let that possibility linger, a column of men lost to fog and forest, their names worn away with the weather on stones that were never carved. It may be what happened, or it may be that the ninth story continued elsewhere, along another river line under another sky, before it finally fell into silence. To follow that other possibility, we have to turn away from Britain and imagine the legion marching not north into the mists, but east, toward different wars and different frontiers. To send the ninth east is to imagine a different kind of disappearance, not a sudden vanishing in the hills of northern Britain, but a quieter slipping away through administrative orders, marching columns, and the slow churn of imperial logistics. In this version of the story, the legion's men did not die in the mists beyond York. They boarded ships. They crossed seas and rivers. The familiar drizzle of Britain gave way to harsher winters along the Rhine, or to the dry heat and dust of the eastern provinces. Their standards were saluted in new languages, by new allies and new enemies. And somewhere far from the island, where we last see them clearly, they met whatever end history has not quite been able to pin down. This idea begins with a simple question. If the ninth no longer appears where we expect it in Britain, might that be because it was sent away before it died? Roman legions were not immovable fixtures. They were tools, shifted around the empire to meet pressure and crisis. An emperor facing a war on the Danube or unrest in Judea or conflict with Parthia could and did strip troops from quieter provinces. Governors petitioned for reinforcements. Legions were transferred across provinces and even across half the empire. We know that other legions followed this path. Units that had once guarded the Rhine later turn up, after a gap in the record in Syria. Legions that had camped for decades along one frontier suddenly appear in inscriptions thousands of miles away, reassigned to a new theatre. When you look at the empire as a system, the idea of the ninth being moved is not extraordinary at all. It is almost routine. The theory that the ninth survived Britain, at least for a while, rests in part on this very ordinariness. If the imperial government needed experienced troops elsewhere, why not draw on a legion that had spent years hardening itself on the damp edge of the world? Some scholars have followed this line of thought along the Rhine. In this version, the ninth leaves York sometime in the early 2nd century and reappears in what is now the Netherlands or Western Germany as part of the forces guarding the empire's long river boundary with the Germanic tribes beyond. There are small echoes that seem to support this. An inscription found far from Britain mentions a centurion of the ninth in a context that may be later than the supposed British disaster. A building inscription, whose damaged lines can be read to include the legion's number, has been dated by some to a period after the legion is thought to have vanished from Britain. If these readings and dates are right, then the men of the ninth were still drawing pay, carving stone, and raising roofs well after the time when, in the British theory, they would already be lying in an unmarked northern field. The evidence is fragmentary, and each piece has been argued over. The exact dating of inscriptions can be a delicate business. Sometimes a single worn letter, a style of carving, or the formula of a phrase tips the scale from one emperor's reign to another's. One scholar might see a letter as a V, another as a damaged X. A building dedication might be placed under Trajan by one historian, but under Hadrian by another. Move the date by 20 years, and the stone that once seemed to rescue the ninth from the mists of Britain may instead fit neatly into its earlier, well-attested life. Because of this, the Rhine theory remains suggestive rather than conclusive. It offers a plausible path, Britain to the continental frontier, guarding a volatile line where Roman and Germanic worlds pressed uncomfortably against each other. You can picture the legion's veterans, used to moors and rain, now watching the broad grey river instead of the northern hills. But the stones and texts that would let us follow them step by step along that road do not survive in the clarity we would like. Beyond the Rhine, the trail of speculation stretches further east. Once you allow the ninth to leave Britain, it becomes possible to place its end in some of the great wars of the early 2nd century, especially those fought far from the Atlantic winds. The eastern provinces saw repeated, intensive campaigns during this time. The emperors Trajan and Hadrian both faced conflict in the region. And beyond Rome's eastern frontiers lay Parthia, a rival empire, wealthy and dangerous, whose cavalry and archers had already, in earlier generations, inflicted terrible defeats on Roman armies. One suggestion, then, is that the ninth was sent to the eastern theatre and perished fighting Parthia, or in the unrest that often followed major campaigns. In this vision, the legion joins the long march of an imperial army moving down through Asia Minor toward the Tigris and Euphrates. Instead of rain-slicked roads and peat bogs, the men tramp under hard sunlight, past caravan routes and irrigated fields, toward cities whose names belong to a very different set of stories. Rome's wars with Parthia could be brutal and chaotic. Armies pushed deep into foreign territory, supply lines strained, local revolts flared up behind them, and the terrain and climate demanded kinds of endurance very unlike those needed in Britain. If a legion suffered disaster here, cut off in a counterattack, worn down in a long siege, or broken by disease and attrition, it would not necessarily leave behind the same kind of archaeological fingerprint as a lost legion in a northern bog. Another eastern possibility links the ninth to the great Jewish revolts in the eastern Mediterranean. These uprisings, spaced across the 1st and early 2nd centuries, drew in large numbers of Roman troops. Cities were besieged, entire districts were devastated, and the fighting could be fierce and prolonged. Later Roman authors, writing with a mixture of horror and pride, describe whole towns put to the torch, populations uprooted, legions hard-pressed by desperate defenders. If the ninth was transferred to Judea or neighbouring provinces, it could have taken part in sieges, street fighting, and hard counter-insurgency work. Units did suffer serious losses in these campaigns. It is not impossible to imagine the Ninth reduced bit by bit in such struggles, its centurions killed in alleys and on ramparts, its cohorts worn down as year followed year. In that scenario, the legion might not have died all at once, but been bled slowly until, on some later reorganization of the army, its battered remnants were folded into other units and its number quietly dropped. Here again, the problem is not that this could not have happened in a general sense, but that specific links to the Ninth are hard to establish. We know which legions definitely served in certain Eastern wars because their names appear in clear dated inscriptions or because ancient historians explicitly list them. The Ninth does not appear in those texts with the same certainty. To place it in Judea or Mesopotamia, modern historians have to rely on more indirect reasoning, gaps in legionary lists, the timing of transfers from other provinces, and the ways in which imperial priorities seem to have shifted. Underlying all these Eastern theories is a basic feature of how the Roman army was recorded. A legion's presence in a province is easiest to see when it leaves something behind, an inscription marking the building of a fort, a tombstone for a soldier, a dedication to a god from a commander. But when a legion was transferred, especially in a hurry or as part of a temporary concentration of forces, it might leave a lighter trace. Administrative documents could be stored in provincial archives that no longer survive. Personal letters and accounts could vanish with the papyrus they were written on. A short stay might never result in a durable stone monument at all. The bureaucracy that kept track of all this did not intend to confuse future historians. It simply functioned on a different timescale. Governors needed to know which legions were in their provinces. The emperor needed to know where his troops were. But there was no guarantee that the paperwork of those decisions would be preserved for 2,000 years. A legion could march in, fight, lose heavily, and be reconstituted or merged, and if no surviving author chose to make a narrative of that particular story, the event might only be glimpsed indirectly, as a change in the lists or a sudden silence. When scholars today argue over the fate of the Ninth in the East, they are often weighing just such silences against one another. On one side is the absence of solid proof for its total destruction in Britain. On another is the absence of its name in the clearest accounts of known Eastern wars. Between these absences lie a handful of contested inscriptions, a few scattered names of officers that might be placed later than we once thought, and the broader patterns of how legions were usually moved and used. Some historians are drawn to the Eastern theory because it feels tidier in the larger imperial picture. If trouble flared on the Rhine or in Judea, it makes sense that legions from what might have been considered a relatively pacified Britain would be redeployed. Others remain cautious, preferring not to move the Ninth too far from the last place it is securely attested without more decisive evidence. In the quiet of the night, you can feel the pull of both approaches. One invites you to see the Ninth's eagle travelling from shore to shore, through ports and along roads whose names we can still trace on ancient maps, ending its life on some distant battlefield under a burning eastern sky. The other urges you to remember how easily stories can outrun what the stones and texts will actually bear. Somewhere between these possibilities, the legion's real path is lost. The records that would have fixed it are gone, worn away like paint on a shield. All that remains are these fragments, disputed inscriptions, gaps in lists, and the knowledge that the empire's armies were always on the move. From them, different historians build different maps. One places the Ninth's last camp on a windy British hill, another traces it along the Rhine, a third sees its standards glinting briefly on an eastern road before they vanish. None of these maps can yet be drawn with unbroken lines. And around that uncertainty, as the centuries pass, something else begins to grow, not just theories, but legends. Legends like clean endings, clear villains, bold heroes, a last stand in the rain. The real past is rarely so generous. It leaves us with smudged ink and broken stone, but where the record falters, imagination steps forward, quiet at first, then more confidently, until speculation begins to feel like memory. The ninth story shows this process almost in slow motion. For centuries after the Legion disappears from the formal lists, almost no one seems especially troubled by it. Ancient writers do not linger over its fate. They do not tell us about banners trampled into mud or a final, desperate speech on a British hillside. The silence that frustrates modern readers did not, as far as we can tell, trouble most people living not long after the events themselves. The drama comes later. As antiquaries and early historians in the modern era began to piece together the Roman army from stray inscriptions and manuscript copies, they noticed the gap. A legion whose name appears here, but not there, a unit long stationed in Britain that at some point simply stops being mentioned. That kind of absence is like an itch in the historical record. You cannot help wanting to scratch it. At first, the attempts to explain the Ninth's vanishing act are cautious. A lost reference here, a destroyed inscription there. Perhaps the Legion was merged or renamed. Perhaps the paperwork never survived. The tone is often tentative, full of maybes, and it is possible that's. The story is still mostly a puzzle for specialists, a quiet footnote in discussions of Roman military organization. Then, slowly, the idea of a catastrophe on Britain's northern frontier begins to harden. A gap in the legionary lists, combined with the knowledge that the province saw serious fighting under certain emperors, suggests a likely narrative, a disaster, a defeat severe enough that the legion was never reconstituted under its old number. From there, the step to a fully dramatic tale is not a long one. Once you decide that a legion died violently, it is tempting to give that death texture, marching columns ambushed in mist, standards captured, discipline holding just long enough for a noble resistance before everything collapses. You start to see not just missing names on stone, but individual faces, helmets turning toward a sudden shout, shields locking together against a rush from the trees. The turning point, though, does not really come from the archive. It comes from the bookshelf. In the 20th century, novelists took hold of the Ninth and did what storytellers do best. They filled the silence with feeling. A missing legion is, from a narrative point of view, almost irresistibly attractive. It combines the prestige of Rome's military machine with the thrill of a mystery. It has the aura of something official and documented, yet a core event that no one can quite pin down. For someone writing historical fiction, that space between what we know and what we cannot know is a kind of freedom. Stories began to appear in which young officers travel north to seek a lost eagle, tribes guard captured Roman standards as sacred trophies, and the Ninth's last march becomes a tragic, almost ritual passage into oblivion. The details vary, different protagonists, different tribes, different motives, but the core emotional arc is the same: loyalty, courage, betrayal, and an ending that is both bitter and strangely satisfying. Because at last the Legion's disappearance has been given a vivid shape, films and television adaptations carried those imagined scenes even further. Once the idea of the Ninth perishing beyond the wall, or in the Scottish Highlands, reached cinema audiences, it sank into public imagination in a way that inscriptions and scholarly debates rarely can. For many people, the story they meet first is not the hesitant, footnoted discussion in an academic article, but the confident sweep of a screenplay, men in segmented armor trudging toward a fate the viewer knows is coming, but the characters do not. Over time, the invented details start to feel as if they must be drawn from some lost ancient source. An ambush in a pass, a slaughter in a glen, a broken Achilla hidden beneath a hut floor. These images repeat across different novels and films until they acquire a kind of second-hand authority. When readers or viewers later encounter the real uncertainty in the historical record, it can be genuinely surprising. There is a sense of, but surely we know more than that. We do not, and that gap is part of the Ninth's enduring power. Modern audiences are often drawn, almost gently, toward these empty spaces in history. A complete account can be satisfying, but a partial one invites participation. If the record does not say exactly what happened, your mind begins to supply possibilities. You find yourself weighing different outcomes as you fall asleep, testing how each one feels. Did the Legion die quickly in a shock of terror, or slowly over months of skirmishes and attrition? Did any small group break away and survive, telling their story to someone whose name we will never know? In that sense, the ninth belongs to a family of legends that grow around lost expeditions, missing ships, vanished cities. The Franklin expedition in the Arctic, the disappearance of entire settlements in remote landscapes, the last messages sent by units that never report back, all of these cast a similar spell. The combination of structured organization and sudden silence is strangely haunting. We know these groups were real, numbered, documented, disciplined. Then, abruptly, they are gone. The difference is that in some of those modern cases, later discoveries, recovered ships, preserved camps, forensic evidence begin to clarify the picture. The Roman world rarely grants us that level of closure. Time has worked longer on its traces. Parchment rots, wood burns, stone is reused. Whole archives disappear not in a single dramatic fire, but in a slow erosion of shelf and wall and roof. Scholars, working with what remains, tend to speak a different language from novelists and screenwriters. Where popular retellings are comfortable with declarations, the ninth was wiped out here. Historians are more likely to say, our evidence allows, but does not require, this conclusion. They place the legion's last sure appearance in one place and time, list other possibilities, and then, very often, stop. To some, especially those used to narrative closure, that caution can feel unsatisfying. It can seem as if the scholars are withholding an answer that must surely be there, if only they would commit to one version. But the restraint is not stinginess, it is fidelity to the limits of the sources. The silence in those sources is, in itself, a kind of information. When an entire legion is lost in battle, and that loss cuts deeply into Roman pride, ancient authors usually say something. They record the shock, the political consequences, the vows for revenge. In the case of the Teutoburg forest, where 3 legions were destroyed in an ambush, we have detailed accounts of the horror and its aftermath. Shrines are described, reforms mentioned, imperial grief recounted. For the ninth, we have nothing quite like that. No anguished passage in a major historian crying out over the destruction of a famed unit on Britain's frontier. No clear commemorative inscription mourning a disaster. That does not mean a terrible defeat could not have occurred. Local or moderate losses might pass with less commentary. But the way the ninth disappears, compared with other known catastrophes, suggests that if there was drama, it may not have taken a form that compelled the surviving writers to dwell on it, or that their accounts simply did not endure. The silence cuts in other directions too. If the legion had been formally transferred and later destroyed in a major, well-documented Eastern war, one might expect its name to appear alongside others in certain campaign narratives. Its absence from those lists pushes some scholars away from specific Eastern scenarios, or at least makes them careful to frame such ideas as possibilities rather than firm conclusions. So the story becomes not just about what is said, but about where names do not appear, where an expected line of text is missing, where a break in a stone has removed precisely the date we need. Around these absences, legend weaves its threads. It prefers not to say we do not know, but it must have been like this. And yet, in the stillness of the night, the honest answer retains its own strange appeal. There is something quietly compelling about a power as formidable as Rome being, in some ways as vulnerable to forgetting as any individual. A legion could march across half the known world, build forts, fight battles, enforce imperial will, and then slip into a fog of uncertainty from which it can no longer be clearly retrieved. The myth of the ninth, in that sense, reflects both sides of Roman power. On one side, the image of unstoppable legions, numbered and ordered, pressing the empire's boundaries outward. On the other, the recognition that even this vast machine depended on human memory, fragile records and stories told by people who chose what to emphasize and what to omit. What has grown around the ninth is not just a tale about a lost unit, it is a mirror held up to our own desire for endings, for answers, for narratives we can hold in our hands. We circle the same questions, pull the same few threads, and spin, from a handful of facts and a great deal of quiet, whole epics of loss and courage. In doing so, we are reminded that the silence of the sources is not empty. It shapes the contours of what we can responsibly say. It leaves room for stories, but also sets boundaries they cannot cross without admitting they have left the firm ground of evidence. Between that firm ground and the soft plane of imagination, the ninth continues to march, forever just out of reach. When we step back from the legends and look only at what the surviving evidence can bear, a small cluster of possibilities remains. The first is that the ninth did, in some way, meet its end in Britain. Perhaps not in a single cinematic disaster, but through a grinding combination of revolt, ambush, and attrition that left it too weakened to survive as an independent unit. Its name might have faded from the rolls while its surviving soldiers were folded quietly into other legions stationed on the island. A second possibility is that the legion was transferred away from Britain, perhaps to the Rhine frontier or further east, and was later destroyed or dissolved in a campaign we cannot cleanly trace. A brief inscription here, a doubtful reference there, suggests movement, but never confirms it beyond doubt. In this version, the ninth's end is not a lone tragedy on a misty hillside, but one loss among many in the long, restless history of Rome's borders. A third option, less dramatic but entirely plausible, is bureaucratic oblivion. The legion could have been broken up, renumbered, or merged, its identity blurred by administrative reform. In that case, there is no lost army in the wilderness, only a name that stops being used while the men themselves continue to serve under different titles. None of these can be crowned the true story with complete confidence. The same shards of evidence can be arranged into different patterns, and there are always missing pieces. Archaeology gives us forts without garrisons' names, cemeteries without unit labels, scattered tiles and tombstones that rarely align into a single, decisive line. Textual study offers us manuscripts copied and recopied, with gaps where a margin crumbled or a page was never turned. The mystery endures not because no one has tried to solve it, but because the past does not owe us clarity. Time has thinned the record too much. What survives is enough to outline the shape of the problem, but not enough to ink in all its details. In that sense, the ninth is not an exception. Much of ancient history is built from fragments like these, half-legible inscriptions, passing mentions in hostile sources, ruins whose builders remain unnamed. Historians learn to live in that space between presence and absence, to say we do not know as carefully as they say we know. If you've drifted with this story to the edge of sleep, you might find that uncertainty oddly soothing. The past is not a fixed film we can replay at will. It is more like a series of faint echoes, some clear, some distorted, many lost. We listen, compare, and infer, but we also accept that some footsteps have faded beyond recovery. And yet, here we are, still following the ninth's trail as far as it will take us. If you've enjoyed wandering through this mystery, it would mean a lot if you gently tap like and subscribe so you can join future journeys into the quieter corners of history. I'd love to hear from you as well. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight and what other stories you'd like to fall asleep to.